Welcome everyone to the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting number 124. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H7, study of breach of personal information involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. Today we have two sections of time. The first will be about 45 minutes per group, slightly shortened based on our votes that we just had. Elections Canada to start, Stéphane Perreault, Chief Electoral Officer. Ann Lawson, Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Regulatory Affairs. And the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, Rachel Frenette, Legal Counsel, Scott Hutton, Executive Director of Broadcasting, Neil Barrett, Director of Electronic Commerce Enforcement. And we'll start off with Mr. Perreault. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the interest of time, I will use a slightly truncated version of my speech, so if you see me skipping paragraphs, it's to assist the time. Alors, je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion de...
I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with the committee. I would like to address four subjects that have drawn Election Canada's close attention and that relate to your study: foreign interference, the digital information environment, cybersecurity, and privacy. I am grateful for this opportunity to explain to the committee what role Elections Canada is playing to preserve trust in our electoral process and to outline where we are collaborating with others, on the understanding that no single solution and no agency working alone can address these threats. I'll speak first of all about foreign interference. And that covers parts of the other three subjects I'd want to address. In Canada, recent concerns about foreign interference have been primarily around issues of foreign funding of third parties, entities that seek to influence the electoral debate without participating directly as parties or candidates. Bill C-76 will significantly expand the third-party regime and include measures that aim to eliminate the opportunities for foreign funds to be used in Canadian elections. This includes an anti-avoidance clause and a ban on the sale of advertising space to foreign entities. As you're aware, foreign interference can take other forms, including disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks. The expansion of the web and social media has transformed our information environment. Citizens are no longer simply struggling to determine who is a journalist. They are unlikely to know whether a given social media post was sent by a bot or a human, or whether it is a genuine belief or part of an influence campaign, domestic or foreign. There is no simple solution to this, but elements of a response are emerging. Efforts to increase digital literacy are, in my view, a key element. It is reassuring to know that Canadians are increasingly cautious about what they see or read on social media. And I'd add that they are confident, as a rule, in traditional media. Bill C-76 would include a requirement for social media platforms to publish and preserve archives of election and partisan ads. This is a positive step that supports transparency and aids enforcement. Bill C-76 would also clarify and expand existing provisions against some kinds of online impersonation as well as false statements about candidates.
An essential role is to ensure that Canadians have easy access to accurate information about the voting process, including information about where, when, and how to register and to vote. In preparation for the next election, we plan to launch a voter information campaign starting next spring. We will also be monitoring the social media environment throughout the election period to enable us to rapidly correct any inaccurate information about the voting process. And we will create an online repository of all of our public communications so that citizens and journalists can verify if information that appears to be coming from Election Canada actually is. This is something that I've encouraged political parties to consider doing regarding their own communications, so having a central repository of their communications. Together with the Commissioner of Canada Elections, we have also engaged representatives from social media platforms to better understand how they operate and to establish channels of communication to rapidly respond to incidents during the election. A third area of concern is cybersecurity. While we continue to rely on hand-counted paper ballots, Elections Canada is increasingly delivering online services to voters, to candidates, and to parties. One of my key responsibilities is to protect Elections Canada's digital assets based on the advice and expertise of our federal security partners. Over the last 2 years, we have made significant investments to renew our IT infrastructure and improve our security posture and practices. As part of this effort, we are also providing security awareness training to staff at headquarters and to all 338 returning offices in the field. Other participants in the electoral process, including media and parties, must also protect themselves against hacking. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity offers excellent resources and advice to everyone. Some measures are inexpensive and can be quite effective. Other measures, however, may require considerable investments. In this context, the committee may wish to consider the need in the future for parties to receive a special subsidy to help them upgrade and improve the security of their IT systems and explore ways in which such a subsidy could be fairly achieved. I recognize from my own investments at Elections Canada the cost of these investments, and I believe that it's a matter of public interest, not personal interest or private interest of the parties to have the resources as the cost to fight cybersecurity, to ensure cybersecurity increases. The last point I want to address is the issue of privacy. This committee has recommended that political parties be made subject to basic privacy rules and oversight by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. This is a recommendation that I also support and have made in the context of Bill C-76, and I was disappointed that it was not accepted at committee. Parties, as you know, increasingly rely on voter data to support fundraising and campaigning activities. This data may include, in addition to the information that we provide parties and candidates, information about a person's political affiliation or support, volunteer activities, or other information that the party believes to be relevant to its purposes. Bill C-76 would require parties to publish their own privacy policy. This is a small step in the right direction, as the bill provides no minimal standards and no oversight. Bill C-76 is also silent on whether a party's policy should include a mechanism allowing Canadians to validate and correct any information that parties hold on them. But, of course, nothing prevents parties from doing so or from taking other steps to reassure Canadians about the collection, use, and protection of their information. It has been observed that parties have much to gain in having robust privacy policies and practices, and I believe that to be the case. But above all, more importantly, I believe that electoral democracy has much to gain. Mr. Chair, I would like to conclude by emphasizing the importance of the work undertaken by the committee and be happy to answer any questions the members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perot. Next up, we'll have, is it Rochelle? It's going to be? Okay, Mr. Hutton, go ahead for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to participate in the committee's valuable examination of how to better protect the private data of Canadians. I will spare you the introductions to save a bit of time. As the committee members know, the CRTC derives its mandate from various pieces of legislation. The Broadcasting Act authorizes the CRTC to regulate the industry in pursuit of specific objectives, including to encourage the creation and promotion of content made by Canadians and that reflects Canadians in all their facets. De même, la loi sur les télécommunications.
Similarly, the Telecommunications Act assigns the CRTC the mandate to regulate the telecommunications industry in pursuit of particular goals. For instance, ensuring that Canadians in urban and rural areas have access to reliable, affordable, and high-quality telecommunications services. The Telecommunications Act also gives the CRTC the authority to regulate unsolicited telecommunications and to take enforcement action against non-compliant telemarketers. For its part, Canada's anti-spam legislation authorizes the CRTC to regulate specific types of electronic communications. These include the transmission of commercial electronic messages, the alteration of transmission data in electronic messages, and the installation of programs on another person's computer system. Of course, the CRTC, like all other federal departments and agencies, abides by Canada's Privacy Act. The Telecommunications Act requires the telecommunications sector contribute to the protection of the privacy of individuals. The CRTC's policies in this area are limited to the protection of confidential consumer information held by telecommunications service providers.
The committee's work on digital platforms. Earlier this year, we published a report titled Harnessing Change, the Future of Programming Distribution in Canada. The report's perspective is informed by the CRTC's mandate, of course. As such, much of the report focuses on the creation, distribution, and promotion of Canadian audiovisual content. In the digital age, users can now access a growing wealth of content and platforms. As a result, the traditional regulatory approach is less and less able to attain the objectives set out in legislation such as the Broadcasting Act. To address this reality, the report suggests innovative approaches to policy and regulation, approaches that would engage digital platforms that provide audiovisual content to Canadians. Nous avons proposé que toute nouvelle
We proposed that 3 principles should guide any new approaches. First, future policy approaches should not only focus on the production and promotion of high-quality content made by Canadians, but also on its discoverability. Secondly, all players that benefit from participation in the broadcasting system should contribute in an appropriate and equitable manner. New policies and regulation must recognize that the social and cultural responsibilities that come with operating in Canada extend to digital platforms. And finally, future legislation and regulation must be nimble and capable of easily adapting to ever-changing consumer behavior and technologies. The report also identifies some of the opportunities created by the evolution of digital technologies. For example, data on how people find, select, and interact with content could inform how to develop and distribute content in ways that support Canada's broader policy objectives.
We recognize that digital communication technologies pose particular risks to the protection of personal information. The report describes the problem as follows. The development of these online services has also given rise to new ways to misusing data, for example, to infringe on the privacy of Canadians, particularly when services collect data without users' knowledge or informed consent. Data can also be used to misinform and manipulate through fake news or misleading news and information, affecting democratic processes, relationships with others, and the way Canadians view the world. The CRTC firmly believes that protecting the personal data of Canadians and preventing abuses must remain the overriding consideration. The legislative and regulatory frameworks that govern the protection of privacy and use of personal data, however, are not part of the CRTC's mandate on the broadcasting side. Thank you. We'll do our best to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hutton. We'll go to the first round to Ms. Vandenbelt for 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. And actually, most of my questions are going to be for Elections Canada, Mr. Perreault. And considering that I was on PROC when we were reviewing the Chief Electoral Officer's recommendations after the last election, this is an area of significant interest to me, and I think to all members of this committee. You testified before PROC, and again in your remarks this morning, that political parties should come under privacy rules. Now, of course, PIPEDA is where commercial entities fall. The Elections Act is another potential tool that could be used, and we've heard testimony before this committee that political parties and the need to ensure that parties can access voters without interference, that we're different, and that political campaigns, for instance, the do not call list doesn't apply. You can enter apartment buildings during campaigns so that you can reach all voters. Are there specific unique qualities of an election campaign that you think that the regular PIPEDA rules would not apply to political parties? And would it be better that we do this under the Elections Act or under PIPEDA?
So there's a lot of elements in that. I do think that parties should have access to information that allows them to reach out to voters. That's a fundamental aspect of our system, and that should remain. I do think that we have now reached a point where concerns over the use of personal data on the internet requires some measure of protection and some minimal standards. Whether they be in the Elections Act or the other pieces of legislation, I do think that this is an area of expertise for the Privacy Commissioner. My preference would be that it would be under his area of jurisdiction. I also recognize that there are unique realities to parties. I think that the basic principles of privacy can accommodate those realities. If you look at areas of consent, how you obtain consent, whether it has to be prior or a right of a person to seek to erase information rather than get upfront consent. These are areas where the principles, I believe, allow for some flexibility. But I do not believe that there should be no minimum standards applicable to parties. That, to me, is a basic element, and that there should be some form of oversight.
And one of the things that we've been concerned about on this committee, of course, is the data breach and Cambridge Analytica. There are third-party entities that are actually global in nature that are gathering huge amounts of data, and this is allowing for very specific targeting of people who are on social media platforms, which has, as we've seen, influenced different campaigns. Is there, beyond the things that you were talking about in terms of third parties and voter awareness, is there a role for Elections Canada in monitoring the kinds of targeting that is happening on Facebook? For instance, if there is a third-party entity, they're not spending money, and they may be from a foreign source, or they may be domestic, that is targeting particular groups of voters for voter suppression. So, an ad that would go to, for instance, young men between 20 and 25 who are of a particular racial minority, and trying to get people not to vote. Is there a role for Elections Canada or in the Elections Act, or even legislatively, to be able to prevent that kind of voter suppression?
So, again, this is not a simple area. The premise is that, at least in organic content, we don't regulate what's being said. There are exceptions to that in the legislation. There are exceptions in Bill C-76 when there is specific impersonation, for example. So there are areas of legitimate intervention, and when there are offenses under the Act, if we see them, we will report them to the Commissioner. He's the one to enforce that. We do have at Elections Canada, we've had it now for 2 cycles, an Electoral Integrity Office. And that office is concerned about looking at other jurisdictions, malpractices that emerge in other jurisdictions, and to see whether there may be trends, and be prepared to at least alert either the Commissioner or persons that may be caught in those situations and react. But our basic role is really to make sure that people have correct information about the voting process. We really, that's the core of our mandate, and that's where we have to focus our attention.
And we know that this is not a uniquely Canadian problem. This is something that is happening around the world. Is Elections Canada working with other electoral bodies around the world to look at best practices, or how other bodies are handling this, or how to even coordinate in responding to those that are across boundaries?
We certainly have regular exchanges with other electoral management bodies, both in Canada and in other jurisdictions. I think it's fair to say that nobody's found a silver bullet to deal with these issues, but we are all looking at similar approaches.
Much time? Okay, so I'd like to go back to the actual security, the cybersecurity of Elections Canada, of the voters list. We have heard in this committee that it isn't necessarily the actual institutions, Elections Canada, the process of voting, particularly with the paper ballots, which I think that we are probably, it's something we want to keep as a country, that we have that manual counting of ballots. But at the same time, we do have voters lists that are in the hands of political parties, and parties have voluntary measures in terms of privacy. Do you think, and I noticed that you said that there should be a subsidy for political parties on cybersecurity, is there more that political parties need to do in order to ensure that these voters lists or any other information isn't getting into the wrong hands, even inadvertently?
Oh, I think that's a very good point. When we issue the list, we provide with the list some guidelines, which you probably have seen. And if you look at the guidelines, part of them relate to the legal obligations under the Act, the purposes for which this data may be used, and so forth. But there's a number of recommendations that are just best practices that we have no authority to enforce, but are about how do you keep track of who in your campaign has those lists, and making sure that you recover the list after the campaign, and you safeguard them when they're not being used by your volunteers. So there are important things that campaigns can do and should be doing over and above any legal requirement.
And who owns the data? Who owns that voters list?
I don't know that there's a propriety right. There certainly are legal obligation to use it only for certain purposes. Okay, and that's all I can say under the Elections Act. You also mentioned the subsidy. I don't necessarily recommend the subsidy. I think it's something that needs to be examined. I don't know, honestly, whether parties have the kinds of resources that the evolving threats to cybersecurity requires. And it's an open question. I think it's worth considering.
Thank you. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both, Mr. Hutton and Mr. Perot, for your opening statements. In the interest of time, though, I would like to focus on Mr. Perot. A couple of weeks ago, several meetings ago, the investigative journalist and researcher Vivian Krause testified here before a committee and addressed particularly millions of American charitable dollars with a stated political objective in the last Canadian election, sent those charitable American dollars to Canadian charitable groups, which then transformed the money into legitimate Canadian dollars, which were then distributed in many cases to third parties to be used presumably to help further those political objectives from the original American donors. I wonder if you could address your inability to contain, track, and penalize such obvious unacceptable interference with the Canadian electoral process.
I won't speak to the specifics of that case. Now, I understand your question was not about that. And as we all know, money is hard to track and limit. There are things that can be done. The current rules under the Act have a number of weaknesses. There have been recommendations made in the past, and they're part of Bill C-76. Bill C-76 goes beyond that. There are two main weaknesses that are being addressed. One is that contributions that were made prior to 6 months to the writ period in the past were, because of the way the law is drafted, are treated as belonging to the entity. So it's their own resources, even though they may in fact come from abroad. Okay. The second weakness is that the current law regulates elections advertising, which is a narrow category of expenditures, and we've seen in recent years that there's an expansion of the activities. On both fronts, Bill C-76 improves that by expanding to all partisan activities and requiring a reporting of all contributions. It also has a number of additional measures, and one of them is something that I recommended at committee, which is having an anti-avoidance clause precisely to deal with that kind of situation where money is being passed from one entity to another and cleans or made Canadian in the process. So the rules are there. They may be difficult to track and enforce, and we'll be working with the Commissioner and inviting people who see these things to report these matters to the Commissioner so that investigations can take place.
Now, another area of constant concern involves the ability of charitable groups to spend 20% of their revenues, their funds, on political activities. But as Ms. Krause testified, the problem isn't political activity. The problem is political activity that doesn't serve a charitable purpose. And she recommended removing that completely and saying charities can spend as much on political activity to support their charitable purpose as they want, but should it get into partisan politics and support of partisan positions and campaigns in politics, the allowable percentage should be zero. Could you comment on that?
I don't know that I can go very far in that because that's an area beyond my area of responsibility. I think
To be able
well,
to.
I'll take a pass if you allow. It may be difficult from a practical point of view. I think percentages, whatever the percentage is, sometimes make it easier to draw lines where what is partisan and what is political and what is not. And I think if you allow some buffer, it may be from a practical point of view useful. But I'll keep it at that.
Now, Ms. Krause also testified that after a 6-month investigation on her part, she filed a report with Elections Canada. Elections Canada representatives went to Vancouver to discuss the contents of that report, which suggested that of 42 charitable organizations investigated by the CRA, 41 were found to be less than compliant, and there were pending recommendations that 5 of them be disqualified entirely as charitable agencies. Her testimony was that Elections Canada effectively communicated that your hands, the agency's hands, are tied because the CRA, which shut down those investigations or never reported on those audits, does not share that sort of information with Elections Canada.
So I want to make a bit of a distinction here between the Chief Electoral Officer and the Commissioner of Canada Elections. And as members may know, we operate completely independently. And the Commissioner is not allowed to share any information with me or the general public on his ongoing investigations unless there's a need to do so. There are exceptions. And so I'm not privy to the nature or extent of the investigations or the conclusions or the challenges that he would have faced in those investigations.
But is that in hypothetical terms then, is that a problem, the lack of communication between the CRA and Elections Canada?
Again, I defer to the Commissioner on that. I do know that the law in Quebec is much more flexible in terms of sharing of tax information with the DGEQ, the Election Quebec, and that's something that may warrant some consideration in the future. But absent a good understanding of the challenges that the Commissioner is facing, it's hard for me to go beyond that.
Yes. 1 minute. You spoke of perhaps considering subsidies or financial support to political parties in their ability to address the new technological challenges. I'm wondering, do you have the resources, does Elections Canada have the resources to enforce what you can at the moment do?
Absolutely, and I think we are fortunate. The legal structure for the funding of Elections Canada provides a statutory authority to draw from the consolidated revenue. So I can spend what I feel is required and justified to upgrade my ETHI systems, and I have done that to a significant extent in the last few years. That is not something that parties have, of course, and I can tell you I understand the costs that are involved there and the challenges that this can represent. I also know that we have a very rich and sensitive database, but it's very similar to that of the parties in terms of its scope on the number of electors. So how do they protect that, and how they can take measures? I don't want to frighten Canadians or members of the committee. I think parties, I know they're working with the security partners, and I think that's good news. I just think that seeing the cost rising for cybersecurity, there is a public interest in considering whether parties have the necessary resources.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Perot, I'll start with you. Can you say today, as Canada's Chief Electoral Officer, that you are confident that the 2019 federal election is secure against mis- and disinformation campaigns?
We don't control mis and disinformation. I am confident that we are taking the steps that we need to take to address misinformation or disinformation about the voting process. I'm confident that we have resources in place, the Commissioner has resources in place to deal with offences under the Canada Elections Act. But the broader issue of misinformation and disinformation and how information is used to create division within society goes well beyond the roles and responsibility of electoral management bodies. And it's a societal challenge that we're all facing.
What would be your major concern, if you had one overarching concern about the integrity or fairness or legitimacy of the election in 2019, what would that be?
You know, I am quite optimistic about the integrity of the next election. We can't be overly confident, and we have to be alert, but we are taking measures to deal with the challenges. I think, what is concerning to me when I look at other societies, when there's such a big divide, a polarization, is the lack of an ability to even have a conversation about what is a fair election. And, what is the legitimacy of an election? I don't think we've reached that point in Canada. I think that's a critical bedrock to have that, be able to have a consensus on what is fair and what is not fair. And we are doing well, I think.
Okay, I want to direct you to something specific then. As you testified today and have in the past, you have pointed out that this committee had recommended that political parties be subject to privacy laws. You yourself have recommended that. I want to quote your remarks. You said, if there is one area where the bill failed, it is privacy. The parties are not subjected to any kind of privacy regime. I've pointed this out in the past, and I want to mention it again today. The Privacy Commissioner has talked about it, and we are in agreement on this issue. I simply wanted to reiterate that this morning without going into detail. Well, I want to take you into a bit of detail, if I can, Mr. Pro. What are the implications of that failure by the government to subject political parties to privacy laws in terms of the 2019 election?
I think what we're seeing is that Canadians are increasingly wanting to understand the nature and the source of the communications that is reaching them. And I think an important aspect of understanding that is transparency in the ads and the social media. But another aspect is understanding what data is out there about them and who's using that data, and having some measure of a control over that. And so while the bill does some good things in terms of the transparency, I do find that it's unfortunate that it does not go into the privacy side to the extent that it should, which is having minimal standards and some oversight.
I guess I'm asking you why. What's the problem with that?
I don't have the answer to that question. It is late in the electoral cycle. I think this is a conversation that we should have had earlier. I realize now that the election is coming, but I don't know any good reason not to have that conversation. I recognize, as I did in answering another member's question, that parties have special situations, that the rules on privacy should be made to apply in a way that recognizes that special situation. But there's nothing that prevents these privacy principles from being used in an adapted manner.
I want to shift to something different. Last election in 2015, I was in Vancouver knocking on doors at 6:15 p.m. and polling the vote. The polls closed at 7 p.m. When I looked at the TV and saw Peter Mansbridge on CBC call a national Liberal majority, we had many anecdotal reports from people who were counting ballots later in Vancouver that when they turned the ballots over, you could actually determine that the ballots that were cast last took a different hue than the ones that were cast earlier. Obviously, when a portion of the country knows the results of the election before they cast their ballot, that is a piece of information not only that other Canadians do not have when they cast their ballot, but it actually is a piece of information that can influence voting behavior. Do you have any concerns or proposals to address that in the next election, or do we suffer the same result next time?
I don't have a proposal. I recognize the issue. It's an issue that the Act has been struggling with over the years. Historically, there used to be a prohibition on the early disclosure of the results in those electoral districts where the polls were still open. That is, the genie is out of the bottle on that in terms of the ability to contain the information with social media and internet. That's very difficult to do. So there remains a staggering of the voting hours. Now, of course, you don't want the people out west to be voting so early that it's not accessible to them. And you have to look also at the end of the polling day. If we delay the count or hold on to the results, we have poll workers, sometimes people who are not young, working for long hours, 16 hours, and to extend that period out east so that the results are not disclosed out west would be very, very difficult on the poll workers. So there's no easy answer to that one.
Thank you. Mr. Hutton, a question to you. Social media companies are appearing to act more and more like broadcasters of information and news contents. Should social media companies be subject to the Broadcasting Act in Canada with respect to those activities, in your view?
As you are all aware, currently there is a planned review of both the Broadcasting and Telecom Acts, our main acts upon which we undertake our mandate. We've also been asked by government to formulate a report that would feed into those reviews precisely, and that's the report I referenced in my opening remarks. In that report, one of the main objectives is essentially to conclude that essentially anyone, parties who do benefit from operating broadcasting in Canada should be participating in our system. So hence, our answer would be yes. Those who are conducting broadcasting should be part of the system.
Thank you.
It's done. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Saney.
Thank you, all of you, for being here this morning. I have a question for Mr. Perot. We're living in a time where elections have changed. Interference is not only a Canadian issue, it's a global issue. And we've seen reports of election interference, obviously, in the United States, in France, in the UK, and Germany. So, I mean, this is not we're not an isolated country where only we are facing these types of problems, but our allies, our global partners are also facing this. Have you had an opportunity, since our election is coming up next year, and subsequent other countries have had elections in the past, have you had an opportunity to work with your counterparts in other countries to come up with some best practices? Because I would think that a lot of things, there would be a lot of commonality in approach and tactics. Have you been able to discuss with them what measures they've taken, where they've fallen short, where we can plug the gap, where we can strengthen our own system?
Yes, certainly. We have, and we take part in conversations and forums internationally. We've been to Europe and discussed with European countries their measures. One thing that is striking to me is that the quality of our electoral process and its integrity is no longer just a matter of Elections Canada. And we are very independent, and we care about that independence deeply. But we need to work with security partners. We did in the past, but the level of collaboration needs to increase and has increased significantly. We also need to work with parties, and I've asked parties to come together, and I'll be meeting them in the coming weeks to look at what we can do collaboratively. What happens if a party receives a tantalizing offer about hacked information from an adversary party? Are they going to jump on that offer, or are they going to agree to not share it, or who are they going to call, and how are we going to deal with these scenarios? So we have to look, and this is the Macron scenario in France. We have to look at scenarios and with security partners, and we're doing that right now, look at who's doing what, and who make sure that nothing falls between the cracks. And we have to work with parties, and what they can do, because we all have a shared interest in the integrity of the electoral process.
So when we talk about the integrity of the election process, you're talking about, Canadians' access to accurate information in terms of the voting process, where to vote, how to register to vote. So in election campaign, if we can hypothetically, because I want to know what approach Elections Canada will take. You see a message on social media someplace about something inaccurate. How do you respond to that? And do you have enough resources to monitor all the social media that's available?
We are currently purchasing listening tools, and the purpose there is not to listen to particular conversation, and we're not interested in who says what. But these are tools that assist with artificial intelligence, gathering information about what's being said about the electoral process, and we have keywords that we can use. And we have a team also that will be working on that. So we will have a strategy with social media to respond quickly if there's disinformation that's being put out there.
I'd like to share my time with MP Erskine-Smith.
4 minutes.
So, Mr. Hutton, broadcasters under the Broadcasting Act, they're subject to some level of quality control of content. Is that right?
The Broadcasting Act requires that all broadcasting in Canada, according to Broadcasting Policy Canada, be of high standard. So we take our guidance from that part of the policy. What we do with respect to content is we essentially work in a co-regulatory regime. So we enforce a variety of codes which have been developed through public processes with Canadians and with broadcasters to essentially maintain that high standard. So we address issues with respect to portrayal, with respect to news, so on and so forth. And there are also other other provisions in our regulations with respect to ensuring that broadcasting of matters that contravene the law or are abusive or false or misleading news are also addressed through
What's the
those means.
smallest broadcaster you regulate?
We regulate through various means. So sometimes we license, sometimes we do it through exemptions. Some of our smallest broadcasters would be through exemption and would be, for example, community broadcasters or indigenous broadcasters in rural and remote areas. So you probably have companies that have maybe $20,000 to $30,000 in revenue and maybe a few hundred to a few thousand listeners or viewers.
So a few hundred to a few thousand people that a broadcaster can reach, and they're subject to that regulatory oversight. And if I've got 1 million followers on my Facebook page, I'm subject to no oversight at all. Isn't that crazy?
Well, that's part of one of our recommendations that we've made with respect to the review of the Broadcast and Telecom Act is essentially to recognize that all parties who benefit from operating in Canada live up to the social responsibilities.
Thanks very much. Now, Mr. Perot, you mentioned political parties, but not third-party political activities. And I've got just one example, but Ontario Proud's got 400,000 followers on Facebook, and they say we knocked out Kathleen Wynne in the last election, and we're fundraising to knock out Trudeau in the next election, and they're not subject to any privacy rules whatsoever. Is that of concern?
I want to make sure that this is clear. And the Privacy Commissioner will be coming, and you may ask him the question. Third parties in Canada are subject to privacy rules if they are
They're not subject to PIPEDA
if they're not in
It's
commercial.
a non-commercial actor,
Yeah,
so
if
they're
they're
not subject to
non-commercial,
PIPEDA.
that's a nuance. I mean that's not an uninteresting question, but I think the Elections Act does not regulate what everybody does, at all times. So I'm just concerned about expanding here the scope of the Elections Act there.
That's fair, but as someone concerned with public policy, I have greater trust in the Conservative Party of Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada, than fly-by-night third parties that can close down operations tomorrow, start up under a different name, and have all that same data to use. Wouldn't you agree?
It's quite possible, yes.
So you talked about minimum standards in regulating political activities. Would you just, yes or no is simple, I'll just throw out some minimal standards. Real-time ad disclosure, including engagement metrics and the number of ad dollars spent and the source of those ad dollars. So, C-76 goes part of the way, but this would go a little bit further.
It would go further, and I would welcome that, yes.
The ability of citizens to request access to personally identifiable information that third-party political actors or political parties hold about them.
Certainly, regulated entities that participate in the election, that's something that is worth considering.
Okay. And penalties for selling information or sharing information improperly.
Certainly, penalties for sharing the information obtained from Elections Canada, these exist in the Canada Elections Act as we speak.
And last question, you mentioned a short time period between now and the next election. C-76 requires political parties to have privacy policies. Should the Office of the Privacy Commissioner have oversight of those privacy policies?
My view is that the right person have that oversight, and that there should be oversight.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. We're at time. I just have one question for both. I've been doing a lot of media responses just about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and our joint investigation that we're actually going to go over to London and try and hear from Facebook, especially Mr. Zuckerberg. But I guess my biggest concern is the timely response to pulling down, let's say, a third-party ad that's going to negatively impact a campaign. We all know the last week in the campaign is crucial, and it can be affected by the littlest of ads. And just, I guess, recommendation in terms of a timely response to groups like Facebook and other social media platforms. What do you suggest that we do with that to have a quick response that really mutes that immediately? What do you suggest we do?
My suggestion is to do as we've done with the Commissioner, is to establish ahead of election a communication network with them so that you can alert them to problems during the campaign. That is the most effective way to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hutton?
In our case, we don't regulate the fast pace of the social media platforms. We deal with broadcasters on that front. And all I would add is, in our front, one tool we would need in the Broadcasting Act to be able to enforce quickly various matters is administrative monetary penalties, which are not available to us at this point in time.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for appearing at committee today. I know it's, apologize for the brevity of the presentation. A lot of questions to be asked still, but thank you, and we'll wait for the next witnesses to come up. We'll give about 5 minutes. Thank you. Call the meeting back to order. Again, the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting 124. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H7, study of breach of personal information involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. The second round, and we'd like to welcome back Commissioner Therrien, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Brent Horman, Deputy Commissioner, Compliance Sector, Gregory, you're going to have to help me with your last name. Smolinek, but that's easier said than done there. Deputy Commissioner, Policy and Promotion Sector, and Julie Bars, General Counsel and Head of Legal Services Directorate. Welcome back again, Mr. Therrien. Go ahead for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. Last week, I attended the 40th International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners in Brussels. The conference confirmed what I explained in my last annual report, that there is a crisis in the collection and processing of personal information online. Even tech giants attending the conference in person or through video are recognizing this and that the status quo cannot continue. Apple CEO Tim Cook spoke of a data industrial complex and warned that our own information, from the everyday to the deeply personal, is being weaponized against us with military efficiency. He added, "This is surveillance." Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg admitted his company committed a serious breach of trust in the Cambridge Analytica matter. Both companies expressed support for a new U.S. law similar to Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. When the tech giants have become outspoken supporters of serious regulation, then you know that the ground has shifted and that we have reached a crisis point. Your committee clearly senses this ground shift and has supported our recommendations for legislative change. The government, however, has been slow to act, putting at continued risk the trust that Canadians have in the digital economy, in our democratic processes, and other fundamental values. Prenons un instant pour examiner les
Let's examine for a moment the impact of online platforms on privacy and the integrity of elections. As Canadian artificial intelligence researcher Joshua Bengio recently said in Le Monde, and I quote, "Our data fuel systems that learn how to make us press buttons to buy products or choose a candidate. Organizations that master these systems can influence people against their own interest, with grave consequences for democracy and humanity. The only way to restore balance is to ensure that individuals are not left alone when interacting with businesses. What is the role of governments if not to protect individuals? Nothing prevents regulating against excess and the concentration of power in certain sectors." Unquote. These are not uniquely Canadian threats, but global ones. Aside from the misuse of personal information to influence elections, we have also seen hostile states interfering in elections by deliberately targeting personal data. In the words of Giovanni Buttarelli, the EU Data Protection Supervisor, never before has democracy been so clearly dependent on the lawful and fair processing of personal data. Recent investigations in various countries have demonstrated that political parties are harvesting significant amounts of personal information on voters and adopting new and intrusive targeting techniques. In July, the UK Information Commissioner released her interim report on Facebook Cambridge Analytica, which found very serious shortcomings in the way digital players are operating. For example, despite significant privacy information and controls on Facebook, they found users were not told about political uses of their personal information. The UK Commissioner also raised concerns about the availability and transparency of the controls offered to users over what ads and messages they receive. Significantly, the UK office found that political parties are at the center of these data collection and micro-targeting activities. And without political parties, these activities would not have occurred. None of this is encouraging for voters. When we last polled Canadians on this issue, 92% wanted political parties to be subject to privacy law. That's as close to unanimity that one can get in such polling. In September, privacy commissioners from across Canada put forward a resolution calling on governments to ensure that political parties are subject to privacy law. Academic experts, civil society, and the Canadian public all agreed with this position, and so does the Chief Electoral Officer. The government, on the other hand, maintains that while the application of privacy laws to political parties is an issue that deserves study, the next federal elections can take place without them. Canadian political parties' lack of oversight is unfortunately becoming an exception compared to other countries, and it leaves Canadian elections open to the misuse of personal information and manipulation. In other words, without proper data regulation, there are important risks to a fair electoral process, and this applies to the next federal election in Canada.
Investigative actions, and I will be quick here because I'm conscious of time. As you are aware, we're proceeding with our colleagues in British Columbia with an investigation of Facebook and Aggregate IQ. The work is advancing well, but we have not yet made our determinations. We continue to gather and analyze information. For obvious reasons, I'm limited in what I can report due to confidentiality obligations under PIPEDA. I will remind you that we are investigating, among other things, on the access to personal information provided to third parties by Facebook, in particular sharing friends' information with app developers. This is an issue that we raised with Facebook in 2009. Since May, we have had many extensive requests for information. We've received submissions from Facebook, and we will engage in another round of discussions very shortly. Our investigation into AIQ focuses on whether it collected or used personal information without consent or for purposes other than those unidentified or evident to individuals. Since my last appearance, OPC investigators have issued additional requests for information. They've conducted a site visit. They've undertaken sworn interviews with both Mr. Massingham and Mr. Sylvester. And we have reviewed hundreds of internal records from AIQ, including AIQ electronic devices. Our plan, in order to make our conclusions public as soon as possible, is to proceed in 2 phases. One at the end of this calendar year, so next month, and another phase, the second phase, in the spring. The time for industry and political party self-regulation is over. The government can delay no longer. Absent comprehensive reform, Parliament should ensure the application of meaningful privacy laws to political parties. It should also give my office the same inspection and enforcement powers that most of Canada's trading partners enjoy. Individual privacy is not a right we simply trade off for innovation, efficiency, or commercial gain. No one has freely consented to having their personal information weaponized against them, to use Tim Cook's term. Similarly, we cannot allow Canadian democracy to be disrupted, nor can we permit our institutions to be undermined in a race to digitize everything and everyone simply because technology makes this possible. And here I think we go to the heart of the issue. Technology must serve humankind, that is, all individuals. Without individuality and privacy, it is a philosophical and practical truism that we cannot have a public democratic life, nor can we enjoy other fundamental rights we cherish, including autonomy, equality, and freedom. Privacy is the prior condition to the enjoyment of other rights, including democratic rights. Without privacy, the social environment we have in Canada, democracy, political harmony, and national independence, is also at real risk, including those posed by hostile states. As to the specifics of the legislative amendments that might be required, in my view, while there are several excellent elements in the GDPR of the European Union, we should seek to develop an approach that reflects the Canadian context and values, including our close trading relationships within North America, with Europe, and with the Asia-Pacific region. A new Canadian law should reserve an important place for meaningful consent, but it should also consider other ways to protect privacy where consent may not work, for instance, in the development of artificial intelligence. The GDPR concept of legitimate interest may be considered in that regard. Our law should probably continue to be principles-based and technologically neutral, but it should also be rights-based and drafted not as an industry code of conduct, but as a statute that confers rights, while, of course, allowing for responsible innovation. And it should empower a public authority, it could be my office, it could be another public authority, to issue binding guidance on how to apply general principles in specific circumstances, so that the general principles do not remain pious wishes, but receive practical application. A new law should also allow different regulators to share information. Meaningful protection of consumers and citizens online must involve several regulators, and they must be able to better coordinate their work. For instance, the Consumer Bureau, Elections Canada, and others. And, in my view, it is absolutely imperative for privacy laws to be applied to Canadian political parties. Thank you, committee members, for your very important work on this issue, and I welcome your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tarrant, for your testimony. I will go first of all to Mr. Bayless for 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur Terrien. Pleasure.
Mr. Terrien.
Ben. We had some arguments made to us that the PEPITA laws have penalties that are so strict that it would put a chill on getting political parties to get volunteers to come in because they'd be subject and may be inadvertently fined for doing something that they shouldn't have done. So is this a concern for you? Have you seen this, and does the BC laws, for example, have very strict fines? Have you seen this anywhere else where political parties have been subject to privacy laws, that there's been a so-called chill factor?
I must say that comment surprised me because, as you well know in this committee, I've talked at length about the absence of enforcement powers of the OPC. So yes, there are some penalties for certain conduct. And as of today, with the new breach regulations coming into force, if political parties were subject to PIPEDA, they would be subject to penalties for not disclosing breaches that have occurred. But as a general rule, as you know, PIPEDA suffers from lack of enforcement. So I was surprised to hear that comment.
So as it stands right now, that comment does not hold water in your view?
Not in my view.
If we were to, you are asking for these stronger enforcement laws, let's say that happens, and the government gives you the inspection and enforcement powers that you seek, would that become a concern for you as the person, enforcing those laws?
Possibly. What I would say first in answer to that question is that when I recommend that PIPEDA applies to federal political parties, implicit in that is that context would matter. PIPEDA has a number of principles, for instance, the right to access information, the right to be clear on the purposes for which information would be used by an entity subject to PIPEDA. Context, i.e. the fact that we would be dealing with political parties who have legitimate interests, if not rights, to engage in political discussion with electors, would be part of the context. As we would eventually look at the application of PIPEDA to political parties, certainly there could be an examination of enforcement mechanisms, amount of penalties, what would make sense for the various entities subject. I would end with this. In British Columbia, which is the only jurisdiction in Canada where political parties are subject to privacy law, I believe that the enforcement mechanisms are the same for parties as for other entities subject to that law.
Not been any chill on volunteerism that you know of there?
Not that I know.
Let's compare that to other jurisdictions outside of Canada. You said that's for example, GDPR. Does that apply to political parties?
Yes. Yes. Now, as to the amount of penalties, I have not. So the GDPR does apply to political parties in the EU. What is the penalty for breaching the GDPR for a political party? I must confess I have not looked at that question specifically. We could get back to you.
But the laws, the argument that we're hearing is that, hey, we're different political party. You don't understand. It's a very different world, political parties. We need to do data differently. As far as you've seen, you don't agree with that argument. In British Columbia, they don't do it. In Europe, they don't do it either. Is there any jurisdiction in the world that has privacy laws where they've done this approach to say, okay, look, we've got general privacy laws, but we're going to do a whole new set of them, or specific ones for just political parties?
Not to my knowledge, but again, I want to emphasize that I recognize that there is a difference in context as between the relationship between political parties and electors versus commercial entities and clients. There is a difference in context. But that does not mean that privacy laws, including PIPEDA, cannot apply having regard to context as is occurring in Europe or in British Columbia.
Within the confines of the one law, not two,
yes.
two approaches. One quick more question, I'll pass it over to my colleague. Terms of use. Have you looked at the terms of use for all these so-called free applications, free services that I have no choice. If I want to buy my phone, I have to agree to let them spy on me. I use that word, spy on me. If I want to use a search engine, so many of them, the terms of use that I cannot negotiate implicitly force me to allow them to do things I don't want them to do. Then they come in front of us and say, don't worry about it. You can just click this button and we won't do it. But that's not true. They do it, and they do collect it. What they show you changes. Should we be looking at fundamentally, and is any other jurisdiction fundamentally coming in with saying laws that override any company's right to put certain terms of use into their contracts that we have to sign, that we have an overriding one which controls our privacy?
The short answer is no. What exists in other jurisdictions are rules that have stricter requirements on the conditions for consent, explicit or not, meaningful or not, but laws that override terms of use of a company, no. But if in Europe, for instance, there are stronger standards requiring explicit consent in many cases, then the consumer, the individual, is better informed of the uses that will be made. But it does not go as far as you're suggesting.
I keep going, it's up to you. Okay.
And of course, we're looking at this issue on the facts with Facebook.
Okay, but I have right to say I don't consent. Okay, well then you bought your phone, but it can't work. I have right. I say I don't consent to you, Facebook. Okay, but then you can't use me. Then you're blocked out. So I'm looking. I'm asking a question, which is say give to the actual consumer, the actual user. Look, I want to use these services, but I don't want you spying on me. I don't want you following my data, and I don't want you saying, well, you can go and like we had with Google or all these other ones that quote tweak the wording so carefully, but they have changed their terms of use all along to give them greater leeway to take our data and to use it. And I have, as a consumer, zero bargaining power with them, so I must rely on the government.
We're at time, so just quick answer, please. Yeah.
I'll just say there are certain things that are truly required for the service to function. For instance, your location must be given to a phone operator so that they can reach you. Of course, the issue from a privacy perspective is what are the conditions that are suggested or imposed by companies beyond what is truly required, and there is a lot.
Me for 1 year, they don't need that. They need to know where I am today to use it. Thank you, Chair.
We'll go next for 7 minutes to Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for appearing before us again today. We have learned in our study since earlier this year of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook aggregate IQ scandal, as you have in your investigation, the Privacy Commissioner of BC, the Privacy Commissioner of the United Kingdom, that millions of pieces of personal data, including hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, of Canadians, were improperly harvested from Facebook, manipulated by a number or handled by a number of bodies, moved back and forth in the digital world across national borders. And we have no assurance that that original improperly harvested data, that massive data, has been destroyed. Now, we learned just in the last few weeks that your former Ontario counterpart, Anne Kavukian, resigned from a Google sibling in Toronto, Sidewalk Labs, because Google could not assure her that personal data, again, highly personal data within Toronto, could be effectively de-identified, as Google said was their objective. Just in the last few days, a conservative order paper question was responded to by the Liberal government of recent hacks of the Canadian government, 800 pages representing perhaps 10,000 hacks or improper access to various government departments and websites, agencies, websites. And this week, we learned that you have launched an investigation into Stats Canada request to Canadian financial institutions for deeply personal information on at least 500,000 Canadians without their knowledge or consent. And I know that consent is a major concern of yours, to develop a new institutional personal information bank. And the claim here is, by Statistics Canada, that it would be anonymized. I certainly, after seeing Cambridge Analytica Facebook Aggregate IQ, after hearing the concerns, the very legitimate concerns of a well-recognized authority like Anne Kavukian over the impossibility or the unlikelihood of de-identification being achieved. And I'm also deeply skeptical about Statistics Canada's ability to guarantee that all of this information that they're harvesting will be anonymized. Your comments, please. And I know you've just begun your investigation, but is consent a paramount consideration in situations like this?
You've described a number of situations. Consent is certainly a fundamental principle of PIPEDA that is in the relationship between consumers and commercial organizations. But as I've said in my opening remarks, I think it would be useful to consider whether consent, given the complexity of technology and business models, will always offer a meaningful privacy protection, and whether we should look at other mechanisms, such as perhaps legitimate interest under the GDPR. So that's for the commercial sector. With respect to the public sector, consent is not as fundamental. It is an element, but there are a number of situations where the government can require from individuals data, personal information for service delivery. If I put the two together, the use of information either to deliver government services or to offer services for a company, I think it's important to recognize that data can be useful to offer better services either by the public or the private sector. The issue is how do you properly manage that information and have, from my perspective, very importantly, the right legal framework to ensure that the actors, whether government departments or companies, handle that data in a responsible way, and that there is a third party, currently my office, with powers to protect the individual, because the individual will not be able to protect themselves completely faced with large corporations or large departments. So I'm not against the collection, use, and sharing of information to improve services, but I think that our current frameworks in Canada currently are lacking.
But would you consider that this sort of request should at least consider the consent aspect? In other words, a great many Canadians we've seen across the country, their reaction to this breaking story is outrage that their most personal financial secrets, if you will, attached to their SIN numbers, would be collected without their consent.
Statistics Canada is arguing that they can do this without consent based on the current legal framework. So because we're seized with complaints, my obligation is to consider these arguments, consider what complainants will say, and come up with a conclusion.
We don't know what system they are using to collect the data, to hold the data, to anonymize the data, if you will, whether it's just by attaching a code number. But if they're going to use it in the way that has been described, it would seem that there will, as long as they have that data, it is accessible to a potential breach, and that the breach of this sort of deeply personal financial information could have political overtones in terms of the way it might be used if that information was not successfully held.
Put it in terms of the legal principles at stake. Financial information is sensitive, therefore is deserving of a higher level of security safeguards. But we have not looked at the security safeguards put in place by Statistics Canada. But as a matter of principle, the nature of the information in question would require a higher level of security safeguards.
Do we have any idea to which technology company would be employed by Statistics Canada?
Find out when we investigate.
We don't know whether Google might be the data collecting or data.
Doubt it, but we will find out soon.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Yeah, next up, for 7 minutes, Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, you have provided an exceptionally clear and profound description of the fundamental role of privacy in a democracy. You've used terms like we're at a crisis point. The lack of protection puts the public trust at risk. Citizens' personal information has been weaponized. Leaves our elections open to manipulation. It jeopardizes the fairness of elections. And you have said that parties are at the center of data collection. And of course, you've also mentioned that 92% of Canadians want political parties subject to privacy laws as the prime actors, I guess, using that information. Yet the government, this government, has refused to apply privacy laws to political parties. Have you heard any persuasive reason offered by the government as to why privacy laws would not properly be applied to political parties in terms of protecting the privacy of the information they have?
I've heard the argument that it's going back to the context issue that we discussed a few minutes ago. I've heard the argument that political parties need to be able to have some freedom to communicate with electors as part of the democratic process leading to a party being elected. And if we look south, for instance, in the United States, these kinds of arguments actually have a constitutional foundation at the level of principle. But as a matter of practice, is the communication between parties and electors impaired because privacy laws apply to political parties? From a practical, concrete perspective, we know of a number of jurisdictions where political parties are subject to privacy laws, and in these jurisdictions, no one is saying that subjecting parties to privacy laws has, in effect, impaired the quality of the discussion between parties and electors. So theoretically, perhaps there's an argument that can be made, but on the ground, it has not been borne out where these laws apply, and I have not seen evidence. I hear the argument. It's an interesting argument, but I've not seen evidence that the quality of the communication would be impaired if political parties were subject to privacy laws.
Well, Mr. Bayless touched on this, and of course, British Columbia, the province that I come from, does in fact subject political parties to privacy laws. And are you aware of any diminution in the democratic ability of parties to participate?
I'm not.
You're not. You have pointed out context, I think quite properly, that there are differences in context between commercial versus political purposes, but I'd like to focus on the similarities. Businesses are selling a product, political parties are selling a candidate, a platform. Businesses are selling a widget and are seeking money to purchase their widgets, and political parties are seeking donations. They're both advertising. Appreciating the context, is there any principled reason that privacy laws that do apply to private actors should not apply to political parties?
I'll repeat that there is this argument made about the quality of communication, but I don't think, I've not seen at least evidence of an impairment in the quality of the communication between parties and electors.
I want to read from a political party's website. I won't tell you which one. It says this: "It is also possible that your information could be provided to us by a volunteer or friend who thinks that you would be interested in getting involved with the party. Would that respect any privacy law or consent regulations currently in force in the country with respect to the consent principle?"
that might be, so let's look at this example. It's an interesting example. If you apply privacy law, strictly speaking, consent has not been obtained, therefore the party in question should not receive the information. But in order to have a communication between a party and an elector, I think I'd be interested in looking at that situation, the first communication. So friend says to party A, my friend B may be interested in hearing from you. So the party has information about B. One of two things happens. Either B says, yes, I'm interested, and then the communication continues, or B says, I'm not interested, in which case I think a proper application of privacy laws would have the information being set aside and the communication stops. But that may be the first part of the sequence, may be an example where context may lead to a different application in terms of the outcome, even though the privacy principles would apply.
Yeah, it asks about whether you'd be interested in getting involved with the party. It's not asking to be contacted. Does that change your concern at all?
No. I think what I've said would apply.
Okay. Now, we heard a reference to, of course, the information that Sidewalk Lab's controversial waterfront smart city project has created some concerns, and we've heard that Anne Kavoukian, the Ontario Privacy Commissioner, resigned from her advisory role over her concerns about privacy protection. Has your office been looking at that project, Commissioner? Are there any privacy concerns on your end that you're investigating?
We have been in touch, yes, with Sidewalk Labs under a new advisory program that we've created a few months ago, where as a way to bring companies to comply with PIPEDA, in this case, we want to work with the willing and have discussions on how best a company may bring about an operation in a way that's PIPEDA compliant. So we have had a number of conversations which at this point are still at the very high level of generality, but we are engaged in this process. We've not gotten down to a level of concrete details where I could say, am I concerned or not? It's at the very conceptual stage at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Last up for 7 minutes, looks like we have shared time between Mr. Picard and Madame Fortier.
Alors, je vais commencer. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for being here once again. We've had the opportunity to meet a few times during this study, but I think it's important that you return today to share where you are at. And indeed, you mentioned with your investigation that it's difficult for you to share information at this point, but I'd like to know if you have any idea when you'll be able to table your report. We'll try to do it in 2 stages. We are going to conclude it by the end of the year. I think that was 1 year that we were given to do it. So yes, the 1st of December perhaps for phase 1 and in the spring for phase 2. Indeed. So in an effort to disclose our conclusions as quickly as possible, we will do it in 2 stages. So we'll make public the first part in December and the next in the spring. Do you think you have all of the information you require until now? I know that our committee tried to bring up certain issues, but do you think you have the resources that are required to really do this? Well, we've had several rounds of discussions with the 2 companies in question. Until now, we have received information, the information that we requested, and we're validating that information at this point in this time. Did you want to add something, Brent? For both organizations, Facebook and Aggregate IQ, we're asking several questions and for supporting evidence. In your recommendations, you would like to see a privacy legislation for Canadian political parties. Thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to know if you believe that there should be a review or other provisions for third parties. I was wondering if there was anything new that you wanted to say about third parties and what might be required for them. Well, in BC, the equivalent of PIPEDA applies to all entities, including not-for-profits, on the basis of the fact that all organizations, whether they're commercial activities or not, gather information, some of which can be sensitive, and that therefore they should be subject to the same provisions. When you're talking about third parties, when we were talking about a specific organization in Ontario earlier, I think that the law should apply to all organizations involved in commercial activities or not, who gather, use, or share personal information. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to my colleague. Thank you, Mr. Terrien. We understand that we'd like to have better oversight and control, and I'm not against that either, because honestly, I think we need to keep an informed eye on what is happening, and I don't have the impression we're able to really identify exactly what it is we're trying to identify or monitor. So do we need to use a more radical means of doing this? I'm not sure that we've really defined all of this very clearly. So I'd like you to comment on this scenario. Each company asks information of a client. The client provides it, and along with some detail. And so in and of itself, as my colleague was saying, if I don't give my basic information, I don't have access to the service. So on the one hand, with all of the hacking that's happening, there's not much that I can do about the criminal behavior of external forces. If I'm the victim of pirating, it's not through bad faith or poor oversight. There might be a weakness somehow from from outside or from inside these companies. So these are things I can't control. However, I expect that when I'm acting as a member, if I sign up for a service, I expect to have at a bare minimum what the provider can give me. So my problem is not what I'm giving them as information, because transparency will tell me, well, it doesn't matter too much what we're doing with your information. You used to use your information without telling you, but now we're going to tell you what we're going to do with it, and we're going to use it in the same way. So my problem's not the fact that I know what's going on. My problem, and what we're facing here, and what we're perhaps trying to find a better way to deal with, is as soon as a third party comes into the transaction, that's where we lose the control. And so at that point in time, would it not be better, rather than controlling everything that's happening, regardless of the information we give to a service provider in your name, it's private information, and that person or that entity is not allowed to just use it. Whereas if it's given to a third party, the third party can use it as they wish. So should we not be trying to concentrate on those third party uses, because they could perhaps benefit from it, and should the Competition Bureau be involved? I think that in the guidelines that we put forward that will come into effect on January 1st, one of the things we've said is that companies should be more transparent with consumers, specifically regarding their exchanges with third parties. You've taken it a step further, and you're talking about disclosure to third parties. Well, preventing them, yes, from using it for advertising purposes or other. All right. But there are different kinds of third parties. Imagine a company that offers a service that is a tangible service that calls on a third party for accounting services or other secondary functions. Well, should we prevent the main company from dealing with a third party for those kinds of activities? Not necessarily. I think that the solution, at least in part, is to be very clear as to who the third parties are, and to give a true choice to the consumer to say no when the third party's intervention is not really necessary to the provision of service. But the solution of simply banning any dealings with the third parties, do we need to go that far? I don't think that's necessary.
Thank you, everybody. Again, thank you, Commissioner Tarian, for having an abridged presentation. I know it's tough to squeeze this all in 45 minutes or less, but appreciate your efforts on the file, too. I know there's a lot to cover, and I know you're spread on multiple fronts, too, like we are. So thanks for your presentation today.
Good luck on the rest of your study.
Thank you. So we'll briefly suspend. We're going to have there's a notice of motion we'll deal with in about, I'll give us 5 minutes.
Actually, we're going to adjourn.
We'll actually adjourn.